So we did benefit by hearing at least 4 different perspectives from people who are currently or recently have been main actors in the game. We will get to your questions, but before that we will try, Paul and I, in this order, to get a little bit of more information from the speakers. So Paul has a couple of questions to ask, and then I will take my turn.
Okay. George Seraphin, who I think you do know, has asked me one question, which I thought was a good question. And so I'll offer that question out, and I'll repeat it, because I think he was very careful in writing it. He said to ask you, if and when you're giving your senior leadership a 1-minute briefing on the summit and what you learned over the past 2 days, what would you recommend that they do differently going forward? Should I repeat that again? If you're going to, or when you're going to give your senior leadership a 1-minute briefing on what you learned at the summit, what would you recommend that they should do differently? How would you like to do the order?
Who wants to go first?
Okay, I will.
Brave man.
Well, somehow I had predicted a similar question, so I included it in my presentation, but it was at the end, so I went very rapidly on that. Okay. What's a lesson I took from the summit? There is an indispensable tool for any government that is willing to prove its commitment against corruption, against clientelism, against any kind of old school cheap politics that have ruined our country in the past. And this is a transparent financial accountability. To be honest, you know, I'm an economist, I'm not an accountant, and to be even more honest, I never thought much about accounting. But I came to realize, mostly because of my job in Greece, and this summit helped a lot on that, how serious, clear, and transparent accounting can be, how strong a tool it can be for political accountability and eventually democracy. So, what should we do differently? What should we do better? Start implementing transparency in every aspect, but okay, the other aspects are not my concern. In terms of financial accounting, fiscal policy, auditing, and give to the public a clear picture of how the finances of the state work. And everybody should be aware. Everybody, I mean, okay, some information are very detailed and sophisticated and not easy to understand, but I believe the basics could be easily accessible by every citizen of the country. And I think this is a great step towards democracy. That's what I would say.
Okay,
sure,
so
Professor Mourmouras?
Yeah, question. George wants senior politicians, right? Not junior. Right, okay. I have to think. Well, I talk, you know, quite often to 2 former prime ministers and the current president of the Hellenic Republic, and I'm sure when I will meet them after the Easter break, they're going to ask me about LA and the summit. So, briefly, I'll tell them that, you know, balance sheets do matter in a government debt crisis, and transparency and accountability in budget reporting boost private confidence. And then I'm sure they're going to ask me, please elaborate on this, and I'll do with great pleasure.
Who would like to go next?
I think I have already incorporated in my presentation the answer in this question. It is twofold. The first one has to do with the safeguarding of fiscal discipline and commitment to good accounting. So in this case, we have to to adopt and implement several issues that increase government transparency and strengthen accountability. For example, I have some notes in my documents, for example, from yesterday from Gerald Stiger about the performance budgeting by your objectives and indicators, a very interesting idea. So one aspect has to do with good accounting, and the second one with the way you measure debt sustainability, taking into account not only the debt to GDP, but many other measures. I have heard at least 3 or 4 in this 2-day conference, and I think these are very useful. Of course, I'm glad that the government now agrees with us on how you can measure debt sustainability.
We have our...
Sure. This is the easiest question for me to answer because I'm an independent MP, so I don't have leadership. So I don't have to report to anyone. Yes. Yes.
That's how it goes.
So it's a very easy question. I think.
Be forward.
Yeah, of course, of course. Max Weber, the famous German social scientist and philosopher of the 19th century, among other things, he described bureaucracy, etc. But he compared capitalism to other alternatives and concluded that capitalism was superior because it had better accounting rules. So effectively, if you really want to, if you like, my advice to a left government like the one that Mr. Koutentakis participates in is that if you want to beat capitalism, then adopt the accounting rules to ensure.
All right, Mr. Vettas. Professor Vettas.
Right. So just a quick question that perhaps I can package a little bit differently for each of the 4 people in the panel. So I think we would be making a mistake if we understate the progress that has been made in the Greek economy since 2010. There are a lot of measures, including the twin deficits, but also other, where a lot of progress has been made. However, all this has been overshadowed by one deepening day-by-day uncertainty and lack of direction. And this uncertainty kind of feeds on itself. It freezes all sorts of investment. Just to give you a number for those of you who don't have this, investment today is at 11% of GDP, when it was at 25% of GDP before 2008 and for several years. So there has been a massive disinvestment. Capital stock in the country is shrinking every month. And as a result, potential output for the next decades is going down. Now, my question, because I have to ask a question, is how does this stop this vicious circle? And if the key is the lack of credibility in the program and the increased uncertainty, I have to ask this a little bit different to each participant. I'm going to start with Mr. Staikouras and Mr. Theoharis. How do we achieve political stability and consensus if this is a prerequisite for credibility in the program? Is this something that we're going to see? Should we expect to see more turbulence or not? Mr. Mourmouras.
Sure.
My question would be about the fact that, yes, roughly 80% of the Greek debt is official. So you're not exposed to any turbulence coming from the markets. However, the longer you remain outside the markets, structural issues become, to some extent, irreversible, structural problems. And in the end of the day, you are exposed, you are at the mercy of how the Eurozone is going to go. So to the extent that there are questions about the Eurozone, this cannot linger like for decades. So how fast do you think it is feasible for Greece to return to the markets? And finally, for Mr. Koutentakis, I would agree that there was a reduction in fiscal targets. But I wonder whether, as a result of what we have seen cumulatively over the last 2 years, risks are now higher or lower than before. Greek banks are closed for all purposes having to do with banks. There is a sense, right or wrong, in the rest of the Eurozone that Greece is no longer a systemic risk. Is this something that we should be taking into account in policy making and somehow increasing the urgency, the sense of urgency in wrapping things up and moving forward? So basically, the question to all four is how can we put a stop in what we have seen the last 6 years, learn from this and just move forward without losing any more time?
I can take the floor. I think at the end of 2014, we were on the right track. Unfortunately, due to the fruitless negotiations, we went back. We went in a new memorandum and a new MOU. And in this case, in summer 2015, we proved the political consensus. But it is like tango. It needs two. And we didn't have it from the government. Not in the summer, not even in September with new elections. So we will vote in favor of structural reforms and on a different composition of fiscal measures by lowering taxes and lowering expenditure. The opposite of what the government is trying to do. Regarding liquidity and private investments in titles, because we don't have plenty of time, we need the restoration of political trust and credibility. As I told before, this entails government credibility, lower taxes, structural reforms, privatizations, and the absorption of EU funds. Faster, front-loaded absorption of EU funds, utilization of new financial tools offered by the European Investment Bank, and the rational promotion of the European Fund for Strategic Investments. And of course, privatizations.
First of all, we have to remind ourselves it's not just political stability that is required. Political stability is the first prerequisite, and I agree with that. I'll come to that in a minute, but then we also need economic stability in the sense of ensuring that the program is back on track and not behind schedule. And then the the banking system stability, that with the lifting of the capital rules, etc. And only after all these things happen will you be able to talk about growth and anything else. Now, as far as political stability is concerned, speaking for myself effectively, I'm very happy to support any initiative that has structural impact of this government or of any government, irrespective of whether we are in opposition or not. But I cannot accept, for example, the kind of pension system that's coming towards Parliament as having to do with any structural change. And I think that currently the partners are making a huge mistake than accepting and calling this a structural change. We're going to have to pass another pension reform south of 2018, and in my view, that's the only yardstick that you should measure the pension reform, for example. We must not need to pass another pension reform at least for another 10 years, if not for 20 years. By that measure, this reform will fail, and that's why I'm not going to support it. But anything that is real reform, I'm glad to lend a hand to this government and to any government, despite me not participating in it, in order to ensure that we actually put some stability in the Greek people, that every 3 months, every 6 months, every 9 months, they have new reforms coming their way. We have to finally reform each area once and then move on to the next one and reform the next one and move on. We cannot reform and counter-reform every 3 and 6 months.
So the question is, Nikos, Professor Vettas, when Greece, is going to return to the international capital markets? Wow, this is the $1 billion question.
Actually,
Let me try
it's more billions than that.
Yeah, probably. Let me try to and give you, a decent answer. I know there are people, from rating agents, in agencies in the audience, so I choose my words carefully. Well, this started with the exclusion of Greece from the international capital market, as you know. So really, what is at stake, for us to return to the markets, it looks like a kind of Sisyphean task. It's very remote and very difficult. Well, I take it a slightly different view. It's not that difficult, provided, of course, that we do the certain things. If I can open a parenthesis here, perhaps at the audience, they don't know this. I was the mastermind back in 2014 when Greece returned tentatively to the international capital markets. The alternate minister is here. Not all the economic team, was very much favor of the idea. I managed to persuade the then Prime Minister that this is the time to do. Why? Because simply I noticed that there's lots of liquidity there because of the Fed's tapering. Lots of money that are coming from emerging economies to the Euro periphery. And then Greece managed to produce, of course, a little bit of primary surplus. There was discussion about a little bit of economic growth, committed to the program. So eventually, we returned to the markets in April 2014. It was a tentative, first issue. And then the same experiment followed in August, end of August. And then it was the political uncertainty, et cetera, et cetera. So it's easier to return to the markets, Professor Vettas and audience, provided, of course, that, we do the right things. So if we do this, small positive steps, the completion of the review yesterday, we do, Draghi then, President Draghi, my boss, will give us the waiver. Then we do negotiations on debt relief. The catalyst, and I'm going to give you, Nico, a specific answer to your question. The catalyst will be when we get Greece into ECB's quantitative easing program. The numbers there is around 3 billion today. After we repay the July bond, will be 5 billion plus. So the real demand effect out of, say, 50 billion private debt or so, it's not really that big. But what will be important will be the signaling effect that Greece is under Draghi's umbrella. And if, then rating agencies, they're going to see the spreads and the yields going down. Sooner or later, they're going, to give us upgrades, and then, manage also to do this, IPSAS, etc. And there is a steady route. The answer to your question, Nico, is the date that we'll be going to the QE program. We need, to do all this preparatory technical work. It's about 2 months to 3 months. So the first return will be then. Don't ask me, however, when we will get Greece into QE, because as you understand, this is political.
Okay, I will not ask you. Mr. Koutentakis, last word.
Yes, very shortly. you asked about the risks. Yes, there are risks. There will always be risks. But my impression is that risks are kind of overrated. I mean, markets sometimes react very, not in a reasonable frame. I mean, they react too much to one direction or to the other. They tend to underestimate or to overestimate risk with, I mean, not easy to understand ways. So this is also true for what has been called the disaster in the Greek economy of 2015. There was no disaster. There was no disaster in real economic activity. There was no disaster in fiscal balances. We cannot celebrate. We're not going to the street and say, hurrah, we did something. But there was no disaster there. I have the feeling that these risks, these dangers are overrated. In my view, and I'm quite confident of that, the first review will close very shortly, in the next month, say, to give a date if I have to. And then we'll have a sequence of events which hopefully will lead us out of the situation we're in. Completion of the first review, some agreement on debt relief, and market access. These are three steps that will restore certainty in the Greek economy and allow recovery, economic recovery to return. And I'm quite confident that this is the most likely events to come in the near future.
Okay, so I'm being told that we cannot take more questions. A, because we are late, but B, also because I sense there is, if you collect a lot of what was also behind the lines, there is a lot of optimism that comes out of all this. So I would like to thank everybody.
It's the Saturday.
In the interest of keeping things moving, we are not going to stop for coffee, so